Now, on to our first topic of discussion today. It's not a small one. Sustainable journalism. It is Seodacht in Wúnithe. We pose the question, can our democracy survive disinformation, and how is journalism contributing to the pursuit of truth? Our moderator this morning is one of Ireland's premier journalists. She eats, sleeps and drinks politics and has a particular penchant for Northern Irish politics, which is not always easy to get your head around, trust me. She has been a mainstay on our national Irish language radio station, RTÉ Radio na Gaeltachta, for the past 3 decades, and she also presents TG4's flagship current affairs show. Lewardele, Cudigi Fáilte, Máirín Ní Ghadhra.
Gurmaha Devlin, thank you for that very generous introduction. It sounds like somebody I don't know, but anyways. Thank you very much to TG4 agus Lísní Ghawley, as could have heard some of a portach and Sablatia or Madden. On Taver, Tafi Chabadalagan, Comus and then Lahashacht Slán, Raisha and V. Olish, na Noach de Brege, na Mreig, Nurishach a Tavach doch nach a Casta Riav. Tá goleor a déirech gur linne agus gur fúne irisisiúí sileireacht agus fíricí amsú. Céchaí mar sin gúilin irisisiúireacht a chur le tóireacht agus darbhann na fírinne, tá me buíoch nach lumsan cheisian ragart ar maidin inniu, ach tá paneadrá cantúí lin le tóirt faoi. It is often said we live in interesting times. Never has this been more true in terms of news, journalism and indeed life in general. From the rise of conspiracy theorists to the uptick in fervent nationalism to a war in Central Europe and a global pandemic, journalism has never been as important as it is currently. Add social media, unfettered live streaming and the much acclaimed citizen journalist to the mix, and the difficulties in separating fact from fiction, comment from tirade increase as well. And add to the mix private profit-led ownership of media, as well as a gradual erosion in support to public service media, not to mention the constant demand for more content on even shorter deadlines. I've only touched on the tip of the iceberg in those comments, and the challenges that are posed by today's world to journalists. The title of this morning's session is Can Our Democracy Survive Disinformation? How is journalism contributing to the pursuit of truth? We have some eminent speakers here this morning to help us arrive at the answers to these questions. I will introduce each quickly to you, as you know, before they speak. The setup is that they shall have 10 to 11 minutes to present their comments to you, and then, as Evelyn said, we'll open it to the floor for a short question and answer session. I'll let Evelyn explain again later the technological element. I'm not good with tech stuff myself personally. And without further ado now, I think I'll present the speakers. You don't want to be listening to me. Victor Pickard is the C. Edwin Baker Professor of Media Policy and Political Economy at the University of Pennsylvania's Annenberg School for Communications. He has a lot of research done on the history and political economy of media institutions, media activism and the politics and normative foundations of media policy. And his work is particularly concerned about the future of journalism, as we'll hear now in his speech. Would you please welcome Professor Victor Pickard.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you all for having me here to engage with you all these very important topics. I think it's fair to say that the future of journalism, future of public service media, and the future of democracy is all bound up together. We should be confronting these problems together. And I think it's also important for us to try to reimagine what that future will look like for public, as we call it in the States, public media in general. And that's something that I'm very eager to dive into. But before I do, I'm going to offer a very quick caveat, which is much of my work focuses on a case study of the US media system, something that I certainly do not argue we should try to emulate. In fact, I present it as a cautionary tale of what democratic societies should not do. And yet, at the same time, I think there are many lessons that we can glean, especially from our journalism crisis in the United States. I think we can see some of the missteps that we've made and apply those lessons to democratic countries around the world, which are also grappling with various journalism crises of their own. So much of my analysis that I'm about to discuss in the next 10 minutes, as much as I can, draws from my recent book, where I look at the historical and structural roots of the local journalism crisis. And it's a sad tale that we're all very familiar with as readers and advertisers migrated to the web, where digital advertising pays only pennies to the dollar of traditional print advertising, and most of that revenue is going to the big bad duopoly of Facebook and Google. This business model is irreparably gone, and it's not coming back. Fewer revenues equals fewer journalists. Newspapers are closing down, declaring bankruptcy, going online only. And I think the take-home lesson here is that we are facing systemic market failure. This isn't something that we can just tweak and expect the market to self-correct. There simply is no commercial future for much of the journalism that democracy requires. And this means we need to find non-market means of support to provide that journalism, and I would argue especially public support. This is where I think public service media have such a vitally important role to play. Now, I'm just flashing a few very quick graphs that all show nosedives in terms of newspaper circulation, number of reporters, number of newspapers, and revenues. And this is all based on data pre-pandemic. We know that the pandemic has only further accelerated this structural crisis. Just a couple data points I'll pull from this. According to some estimates, we've lost almost a quarter of our newspapers in the United States and about 60% of our newspaper employees. And of course, the reason why we focus so much on the newspaper industry is that, especially in the States, but in many countries around the world, they serve, even in their beleaguered state, as the last bastion of original local reporting. They serve as a kind of informational feeder for the entire media ecosystem. Now, this leads to predictable news gaps and news deserts across the country, especially in rural areas, but also in the middle of our largest cities, where entire communities and regions lack access to any local news media whatsoever. I think it's also fair to say that these news deserts aren't entirely new for many communities, especially communities of color. They've never been well served by a commercial system. Now, we all learned in school that democracy requires a free, and by implication, a functional press system. But now we have what are essentially natural experiments where we can see what happens to a local community when it loses its local newspaper. And indeed, every month we have you see a new study coming out showing that, that these communities are less informed about politics, less civically engaged, less likely to vote. There are higher levels of corruption and growing polarization, which needs to be teased out just a little bit more. This isn't a kind of false equivalence. Most of this polarization is really growing extremism, especially on the far right. I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that we're seeing growing neo-fascism or neo-fascistic tendencies in the States, and is being, if not directly caused by, certainly the implosion of local journalism and the vacuum that's creating is contributing to the necessary conditions for that neo-fascism. So now compare this to another growing body of research which shows us that public service media confer tremendous benefits to democratic societies. We're showing that they correlate with higher levels of political knowledge and civic engagement and lower levels of extreme views. And also it's very important to point out, as I often do to my American friends who are often concerned about government involvement in the media and government subsidies of the media, that the strongest democracies on the planet also happen to have the strongest public service broadcasting systems. And indeed, this is based on the Economist's Democracy Index, which is put out every year, happens to show that the US is now a flawed democracy, but at the very least it's showing us that public media is not a slippery slope towards totalitarianism. In fact, quite the opposite. Another very important point that I don't think gets enough attention is this normative mission, this universal service mission that tries to guarantee that all members of society have access to a baseline level of news and information. That's something that the commercial media system simply cannot guarantee. They tend to focus more on profitable audiences. And finally, I think it's fair to say that given all this, keeping this in mind, that public service broadcasting could serve as a safety net for when the market fails to support the level of journalism that we need. And here's where I often, when I'm talking about this stuff, I point out a program that I know you're going to hear about. I believe you'll hear about more later today. Matthew Barraclough from the BBC will be talking about this, so I'll only mention it in passing here, but that is the news partnership program, the local news partnership program that the BBC is funding, and I'd say in particular the local democracy reporting program, where they are providing local reporters at various news organizations across the country to focus on the local reporting that the market is no longer providing. And to me, this seems like a textbook case of what a public system should be doing in the face of systemic market failure. We're seeing a little bit of this in the United States. We're seeing partnerships between public broadcasting stations and local news organizations. There's a few that I would point out, but it's not being done in a systemic manner. Now, of course, to do programs like this requires proper resources. And this data here, I don't know how well you can see that. We looked at 33 countries and their expenditures on public broadcasting around the world and those relationships to the health of their democracies. And again, we found that it correlated positively. Stronger democracies had stronger public service broadcasting systems. You can see that the US is almost literally off the chart here. This is based on GDP, but in terms of annual expenditures, we spend about $1.40 per person per year towards our broadcasting system. Compare that to the BBC, which is closer to about $100 per year. And of course, Nordic countries is even much more than that. Now, adequate funding is necessary but insufficient to ensure the level of local public media and beyond that, to democratize that local public media. And here is where I veer off into a kind of utopian vision. But if we were to imagine, this is something I'm developing in my own work, this idea of a public media center. And basically what I'm proposing is a new anchor institution where you have local public schools, local public libraries, hospitals, why not also public media centers? And I'm imagining that this would actually come out of the public broadcasting system, the public media system. It's an ideal type, although there are some institutional exemplars I can point to. It's based on an earlier independent media model that came out of the early 2000s. And there's still one that exists in the middle of the cornfields in Urbana, Illinois, where local independent media activists bought the downtown post office, which now serves as this community media center, provides a monthly newspaper, a news website, local broadcasting, as well as community wireless services, so it's providing broadband as well. And it also just serves as a community meeting space where people get together, like a media maker space. They create their own media and tell their own stories. Now, regardless of whether that would be our ideal or not, I think there is a useful schematic here, or I hope it's useful, where we tease out the various layers to help guarantee that we have local democratic media coming out of our public media system. And this can be thought of in terms of the funding and governance layers, as well as the ascertainment layer. That's where public media journalists are going into local communities and ascertaining what are their local needs, what do they want to see covered in their information systems. And I think I just lost my PowerPoint slides, so you have to imagine I had one final slide that was going to show just a brief slide that shows what our public media looks like in the United States. But I will instead conclude by saying that right now, public service media are uniquely, there it is again, let's come back. The last two layers here, I want to talk about the infrastructure layer as well as the technological layer, and that's looking at the algorithms. How can we at an algorithmic level guarantee that public media are being featured? We could talk about this in terms of signal boosting in, for example, social media feeds, Facebook news feeds. And finally, the most important one, of course, is the engagement layer. How do we guarantee that local members of local communities are engaged in this media making process, or telling their own stories? But I want to conclude by simply saying that it's clear, I think, given the evidence, given the retraction of the commercial newspaper industry, our growing journalism crisis, and our information needs, that public media are journalism's last best hope, and that public service broadcasters are so well positioned to provide this service. They have the presence, the infrastructure, and also the public trust. So I think we can say that this crisis is also an opportunity for reimagining what our public media could and should look like. And I look forward to this conversation with you all. I'll end on that cheerful note. Thank you so much. And this is American public media. Thank you.
I'm going to introduce the other speakers from here, if you don't mind. That's a blast from the past, the characters from Sesame Street. I actually saw them on television the other day and couldn't believe it that my children didn't recognize them. It was a bit traumatic for me, I must say. Big Bird wasn't recognized. I'll introduce our next speaker now. It's Razan Ibraheem. Razan is an Irish-Syrian journalist and a senior editorial analyst with the company Kinzen. She has extensive expertise in researching misinformation and disinformation. Kinzen is the company that came from Storyful, which was a very innovative company when set up, verifying and investigating content from social media. And Razan has had huge experience in verifying material from war zones around the world and from places of conflict such as Yemen, Iraq, and Libya, and therefore has a huge range of information to share with us about that particular difficulty in today's modern era, that's verifying information and be researching basically whether or not stuff is true. So we'll introduce Razan and let her tell you and share her expertise. Gurmagat.
Thank you so much for the introduction. I prepared a few sentences to talk about my previous experience, but deleted everything, and I just want to say one small thing here, that when I was in Syria, my dream was always to be a journalist, but under dictatorship, it's impossible. But when I moved to Ireland, I believe that democracy gave me this opportunity to be a journalist, to tell the truth. So I'm always grateful to live in a democratic country and as well in a democratic nation. So essential for journalism and telling the truth. So I came from a troubled Middle East that is thirsty for freedom and democracy. I came from a region where authoritarian governments, regime, and monarchies control every single aspect of our lives, including our unfiltered and independent access to information by right. It is only their information or no information. In this region, traditional media is used as a powerful weapon to control the political, social, religious narratives and to spread disinformation that celebrates the master and his throne. These authoritarian governments might have survived and will probably continue to survive because of disinformation. The rise of social media, however, has turned the tables on them, paving the way for the wind of change. I cried when I watched the videos of millions of brave women and men protesting in the street for freedom and democracy, and I was honored as well to be able to work and verify and help these stories to be outside to the world. What I would like to say here that their disinformation or the disinformation coming from these authoritarian government has moved from traditional media to social media and has become more sophisticated. Although they can't control the flow of information on social media, they can, however, manipulate public opinion, spread false information, and most importantly, confuse people. And this is exactly what currently pro-Kremlin actors and Russian propaganda is doing right now. Disinformation is not limited to weak democratic government or authoritarian regimes. Information coming from democracy itself sometimes can be questioned. Yes, democracy in the West, in EU, in America, in Canada, and other democratic countries has been instrumental, effective, and important in defending freedom of speech, exposing corruption, reporting on human rights abuses, and uncovering scandals. And I think as well, most importantly, is the peaceful transition of power. However, Iraq war, I believe, was one of the examples of how disinformation was used to help government's narrative. I clearly remember the joy of one of the American TV or the host of one of the American TV when the first missile was launched towards Iraq. In the past years, there were 3 major global stories where disinformation and misinformation played pivotal roles on how these stories were covered. Disinformation during US elections was not just disinformation. It was driver of events that led to the January 6th attack on democracy itself. COVID misinformation has been or has undermined public health efforts to control the global pandemic. And we are here today watching how pro-Kremlin and Russian government accounts are using traditional media and social media to spread propaganda and justify the invasion of Ukraine. Just from my personal experience, I worked on many stories from the war in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, elections, American elections in 2016, 2022, and COVID. But I can say that the misinformation, disinformation I have seen since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it's a scale that I haven't seen before. And the sophistication as well of propaganda on social media, it's as well I haven't seen before. So we in Kinzen are at the heart of these and other stories, trying to separate noise from news, monitoring evolving campaigns and narrative, and decoding misinformation, disinformation language. So Kinzen is founded by Anya Kerr and Mark Little, who deeply care about keeping online communities safe from harmful content. So what do we do? So Kinzen, mainly we provide expertise and ideas on how campaigns on social media are evolving, how the language as well is evolving around that. We focus on disinformation, political disinformation, misinformation in general, hate speech against protected categories, for example, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-LGBTQI community, and also other hate speech against protected categories. And what also we focus on dangerous conspiracy theories. Like we monitor closely the movement, for example, the online movement of many, I'd say, far-right groups on social media. We monitor QAnon conspiracy theory, the Great Replacement, where we actually we have seen a rise in this narrative recently, especially after the Buffalo attack last week, where this Great Replacement theory has been repeated by mainstream media in the US, and we see that it is reflected in recent attacks. What also we monitor, like 5G, for example, conspiracy theory, etc. So that's our main work on that. So what we mainly as well do, I believe human expertise in fighting disinformation is crucial, but it's not enough. Technology is crucial, but it's not enough on its own. So what we do in Kinzen, we blend the human expertise with machine learning together to be able to early identify misinformation, disinformation narratives on social media. So we have our editorial network from across the world. They are local expertise. They speak the local language. They have the knowledge of conflicts, political conflicts, society, religion, etc. So they know the local nuances of these countries. And it's most importantly, just to mention here that we sometimes focus mainly on like European countries, US, but there are countries who need more attention, the underreported, the underdog. We should pay attention to all countries in the world and not only focus on certain, like I'd say, regions. So we try to, like from our editorial network and from their local knowledge, we collect data. And this data is about the language used to spread misinformation, disinformation, or hate speech. And in that case, after that, we use our tools, machine learning, to be able to help us early identify these disinformation or misinformation language on social media. So, yeah, just to very, very closely here to say that one of our main focus in Kinzen is actually audio, podcasts, and video. So from the data our experts enter, and from our machine, in this case, we try to identify and early detect any misinformation narrative when it comes to audio analysis, podcasts, and as well videos. One of the most important things as well we focus on, which is crucial for democracy, is elections. So every election, and it is prominent election in different countries, we have our local expertise who would identify misinformation, disinformation campaigns trying to affect and influence elections. So we've worked on the Philippines elections recently, India election, now our focus as well on Australia, the midterm elections in 2022, Brazil, etc. So their expertise as well is super helpful for us to understand the narrative behind that. What we do as well, we provide analysis, briefing, and research on these local markets. I'm going to go very, very quickly here because I am aware of time, just to say that our data is important, is as well entered and researched by experts on the ground. So we collect hashtags, dog whistles, slogans, phrases, and we provide description, the high risk of these language, and also aliases, any other variation of certain dog whistle or hashtags being used. My last example on that is, this is just an example on how our data works. As you see here, medical misinformation, we have elections, dog whistles and hashtags related to French elections. And the last one I'm going to here focus is the Russian propaganda. For example, we have here Kiev regime. Like from our research and analysis, we started to see a pattern that Russian propaganda used to spread their disinformation. So for example, KIEV, this way of writing Kiev, is mainly used by Russian accounts. They don't tend to use the KYIV version of Kiev. So that is one of the how we detect, how we understand where these keywords, hashtags, and dog whistles are coming from, and we monitor on a daily basis. Yeah, to finish up here very, very quickly, that disinformation is really, really complex. And to fight it needs a lot of effort, and there is no magical wand that would solve the problem. That's why, like, from our expertise in the last, maybe I'd say 2 years, trying to understand these narratives, early detect, and have a successful marriage between human expertise and machine learning to be able to tackle disinformation, misinformation on social media and online. So that's it from me, and thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Razan, and some very fascinating examples there in the hashtags and, as you call them, the dog whistles about different things in different elections globally. I could sit listening to you all day. Very, very interesting indeed. Our final speaker now is Olaf Steenfadt. Olaf heads the Journalism with Trust initiative at the press freedom watchdog Reporters Without Borders. He is also a member of the high-level expert group on fake news and online disinformation at the European Commission and of the Committee on Experts on Quality in Journalism in the Digital Age. That's some collection of titles and some collection of expertise, Olaf. So will you please welcome Olaf, and he'll share his thoughts with us on this issue.
Thank you very much. So, why? Why should we be doing this? Why should a press freedom watchdog, a human rights NGO, engage with the topic of disinformation? 2 reasons there, maybe. Some of you might have heard or dealing with, you might say, a new buzzword in our industry, which, talking about buzz, which is solutions or constructive journalism. In other words, to say, as journalists, we are not only recording things and blaming people, but also providing tangible solutions. The exact same conversation is going on in the NGO world as well, where we are beginning to understand that we are not only around to blame and shame, and no worries, we will continue to blame and shame perpetrators and enemies of press freedom, but also to provide tangible solutions to the big problems our industry and actually humanity faces. The second reason, and Victor touched upon this already, is related to our mandate. We are around to protect and defend individual journalists, which is pretty much casework, providing protective equipment, Kevlar vests, helmet, but also legal support, mental support. And make no mistakes, this not only happens in faraway places, but at our own doorsteps. I'm from Germany. Many journalists in Germany attend demonstrations, manifestations only with a security detail and protection these days. But we begin to understand that the threat level is systemic these days. And this is why we have to engage at a systemic level as well, which sounds pretty much like talking to politicians and looking at regulation. And yes, that's what we do. However, we also acknowledge that we operate, at least on a global level, in a pretty much unregulated space when it comes to digital, where code is the new law. And this means for us, we also have, if we like it or not, we have to engage with technology when it comes to solutions. And Victor mentioned the technology level when it comes to changing the game, at least as one building block. So what are we talking about? Sustainability is the title of this session, and we believe it's very much tied to credibility. And I think what we are proposing and trying to build is the missing link between sustainability and credibility, and in the best case, make investment in ethics and ethical journalism pay off. And as we all know, the exact opposite is happening online at the moment, because algorithms amplify and push the exact opposite of ethical journalism. Driven by engagement, they push hate and falsehoods and conspiracy theories and lies. And changing this logic is what our proposals and interventions are all about. I might quote somebody who some of you might know, John Williams, the managing director of RTÉ, who was sitting next to me on a panel at Perugia the other day, and he said, it's all about rebuilding and sustaining trust with our audiences. This is about credibility, and 3 things are needed to do this: objectivity, transparency, and humility. And he said, objectivity and transparency, that's not new, we know this. Maybe we are not living up to this all the time, but in principle, we know that this is how we build trust. The hardest part is humility. In such an ego-driven industry, to really take a deep look into the mirror. I mean, it's always easy to blame others, and most of them deserve the blame. But what about us? Are we really sticking to our own professional norms? And what happens if we don't? Journalism is about taking and holding others to account. But who is holding us to account? Roll tape, please. So welcome to the Journalism Trust Initiative, which is one piece of technology actually we built and launched about a year ago. And what you're seeing here is not a PowerPoint presentation. This is the actual platform. This is a live web application. Just to give you, because I was supposed to present a real solution that's meaningful and ready to be used, what it is looking like. And what is the JTI all about? So first of all, it is, if you wish, a compliance tool. So this is, if you log in as a media outlet, the dashboard you will get. Basically built on an official ISO-type standard document, which we published together with the European Committee of Standardization in 2019, turned into a questionnaire. And as you can see here, the requirements are pretty much about identity, tell us who you are, ownership, sources of revenue, and it's interactive, so you can click on each one of those standard clauses and basically fill the questionnaire in any order you want. And the second chapter is about editorial management systems, correction policies, etc., which all of you have in place, but this is about a diagnostic tool to just run your editorial systems and guidelines past the checklist, maybe detect certain gaps and flaws, address them. And what's maybe also important to mention, if you look at the list, this whole exercise is not at all about content, because we believe that would be a terrible idea to try and objectify content, actual articles, but it is about the manufacturing level of journalism. We believe this is indeed objectifiable. So if the respective processes and guidelines are in place and enforced, the likelihood that the outcome, the actual content, is better, whatever better means, is higher than if this is not the case. This is, in the first stage, a totally internal exercise. It's a self-assessment, a diligence tool, if you wish, for your newsroom. However, whenever you think it's worth publishing it, you can do this via this app. You get a designated HTML code you can put on your website. And the result looks like this. It's more or less like a structured imprint. This is what the audiences, the public, will see. Pretty much the same structure, the standard clauses, and if you can click on each one of them, you get the disclosure publicly visible. And that's the main point here. It is also machine readable, and I will get to this point in a minute. And then as a third stage, and everything is of course fully optional, and because this is an official ISO type standard, it is also externally certifiable. Basically meaning hiring an audit firm and let them check independently if you're actually living up to what you claim and what you disclose. Let me show you a very quick example of product integration. We have at the moment around 200 media outlets, big and small, north and south, different types and stripes, using the JTI at the different stages. Many public media organizations, France Télévisions, CBC Radio Canada, RAI, LRT in Lithuania, NRK, RTÉ in Ireland, but also larger publishing corporations, commercial media, and what's closest to our heart, I must say, at RSF is also smaller media outlets, community radios all around the world, including the Global South. So Swiss Info, Swiss Public Broadcasting, SRG went through this process, and if you click on any of their articles, towards the end they would have here the JTI certification mark. And you can click through to a little explainer text where they explain what this is, and then further on to the actual certificate. In this case, they hired Deloitte, like a big audit firm, to get certified. And the rest is pretty much what you've seen already, the public disclosure. Now it's called certificate instead of transparency report. Maybe also worth mentioning, and this is the case with any ISO standard, this is not a ranking exercise. An ISO standard per definition is always binary. If you buy a toaster or a hairdryer, it's either electrical safe or it isn't. And this is exactly the same here. So this is either fully compliant, 100% or not. And of course, this is all, at the end of the day, about benefits. And this is maybe the important part here. We hope, and this is what we see with lots and lots of cases and proof of concept, this is already beneficial in internal terms, like internal compliance and diligence tool, but also externally as an accountability and transparency instrument. But, and this brings me back to regulation, we've just issued a press release last night referring to the European Commission's DSA, DMA package, which I think all of you have heard, where the so-called Code of Practice on Disinformation is one kind of element in the DSA, which includes very, very specific commitments and obligations for platforms. And under the chapter of user empowerment, there is one part and specific commitments for platforms to use trustworthiness indicators, and the JTI is explicitly mentioned to feed into the recommender systems and make this transparent. And this would indeed be a game changer. We still have to see whether or not platforms will actually live up to it and comply with the code of practice, or maybe just pay a fine. I mean, we've seen it before. But in essence, if this were to happen, it would result in elevated discoverability and reach, and ultimately, if it's commercial, also revenues, which can be a game changer. And as well, we have, and I think this kind of builds on what Victor was saying as well, proposed a new deal for journalism, which calls on governments to spend at least 0.1% of GDP on journalism. Not very many governments do this at the moment, but I think we see trends in this direction. And if, by whatever means, direct subsidies or indirect support like tax breaks, governments want to support journalism, they need a normative benchmark to allocate these funds. They have to make a call, and no decent government wants to make this easily. What's a legitimate media outlet and what isn't? And if you can point to an official ISO standard as a benchmark, it would also politically speaking make things so much easier. In closing, I just want to say that all of you are close to my heart because I started my journalistic career at Norddeutscher Rundfunk, which is a German regional station, member of ARD, and worked many, many years for ZDF. I really believe that public media should be first in class when it comes to trust and investing in ethical journalism. So please be invited to try out the Journalism Trust Initiative. Hit me up, I'll be around, and I hope that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Olaf. Very interesting, particularly the Journalism Trust Initiative, which we should all take a look at. We've got some time left now, so we can have a discussion amongst ourselves here and talk about some of the main points that came through in your presentations. Also, anyone who would like to pose a question from the floor later on, there will be a chance. And there's the Slido app, as Evelyn mentioned earlier, on which you can pose your questions. It came across through all three presentations, Victor, the importance of a public service media in a thriving democracy. At the moment, that seems like a contradiction in terms when you speak of the United States, or am I overstretching there?
Not at all. In fact, it's probably worse than you think. It's a very dire situation, and of course we don't have the safeguards that many democracies take for granted. We don't have strong public media systems, and all that said, I tend to be cautiously optimistic by nature. I guess the question is, how bad will things need to get first? But I do think that there is growing awareness that journalism should be thought of as a public service. I think the pandemic really drove that home. And so even for Americans, where there tends to be a stronger sense of market fundamentalism and libertarianism, I believe they're starting to see the value for these kinds of public services. So I'm hopeful that we'll start to turn it around. But it's a political fight. It's going to take social movement from below to make this happen.
And you mentioned, Olaf, this requirement that you would have that 0.1% of GDP would be spent on journalism. How many governments are going to accept that? Because certainly we know in this country that there is a challenge at the moment in getting government to recognise the full value of public service journalism.
Well, as a specific example, I can point at Canada. Even before the pandemic, they passed a law to allocate 600 million per year in tax breaks to journalism. The problem is that the law doesn't include any kind of indication how to allocate these funds. And then I think there are additional funds from the Ministry of Heritage to support local and community media. I think in the United States we see some, even, if the overall picture is quite dire, at kind of local and state levels, also some movements where funds are reserved to support particularly local and community media. I think, again, the devil is in the detail how to allocate these funds and how to also evaluate the outcome, I think, which is another challenge.
And one of the other challenges that we see, Razan, is trust. You mentioned it specifically, that people need to be able to trust their sources, not just the journalists themselves, but the people who are consuming the content.
Yeah, absolutely. Trust, credibility is something really important, essential to tell the truth and also to follow the social movement in each country. I have to say, like, where I come from, there is zero trust. And at the same time, these media outlets are funded by government. They are publicly funded, and there is zero trust in them, which is really a challenging, it's a big question as well. Like, with these public funded, always like trying to reflect what is happening in the street, what people are saying, with credible information, make people as well access other information. Really challenging, especially when it comes to places where there is no democracy. but still funded by government. So that's why, like I was saying, social media in this regard help a lot because people are exposed to different kind of information, but the challenge comes when as well this information is misled or there is a tension of changing political opinion using baseless claims, lies, etc. I think it is really complex, and
it's very complex, and it's also, we'll say, with social media, there's the devil is in the detail, as Olaf said. That there is the benefits in a Middle Eastern context, but then there's the downside, and we saw that with, we'd say, Donald Trump. That social media became his platform of choice. And there was very little regulation of social media, and therefore very little regulation of what Donald Trump would say.
This is true. Basically, they served as an amplification infrastructure for Donald Trump and his allies, and which is kind of ironic in the United States. You may have heard that there's this growing argument from conservatives that there's a liberal bias to social media, and that they are being systematically disenfranchised from social media. But all the data show that the top performers through social media feeds are people like Tucker Carlson and Breitbart and Sean Hannity and those kinds of people. And so it's very clear that, if anything, they are being privileged by social media. Social media are amplifying dangerous forms of misinformation.
And this probably proves to us all of how important it is that it be regulated, that there be a way of proving that these things that are being uttered day in, day out on social media are credible, and a lot of the work that Razan does involves that.
Yes, definitely. I think it's always easy to blame Facebook for everything, and probably we are continuing to do just that. I think it's also still important to mention that social media remains an informational lifeline for many, many people on this planet, because that's the only source or the only distribution channel for independent or other voices they can access. When it comes to regulation, yes, I think the record is a little bit, I think, disappointing in the past. What we believe in as well is simply economic pressure. I mean, at the end of the day, these platforms are commercial entities selling advertising, and a big question and I think also pressure point will be what advertisers think. They call this whole mess basically, or address it from the angle of brand safety, and have a huge vested interest in avoiding their latest Mercedes popping up next to child porn. And this is, at the end of the day, again, a question of technology, because it's not like your media buying agency calls somebody to buy, outdoor, but it's happening in nanoseconds. It's driven by algorithms, and you need a positive list, a positive signal to attract advertising and kind of steer it away from, in the own best interest, not only of platforms, but also of advertisers and all of us in the end, from the bad. And let's not be mistaken, it's not only about showing disinformation, but it's about monetizing bad actors, which makes it even worse. And this is what we are fighting against.
Yeah, and just to add here as well that social media platforms live on heated discussions, on a lot of conversation that I have to say a lot of them not civilized conversation, this is what we aim to have. Like, regardless, like we have different opinions, but at least to have civilized conversation instead of accusation, spreading hate speech, using slurs, using a lot of degrading language, etc. However, when there is a heated discussion, this is when these conversations are amplified, they will appear in algorithm, and that would generate more and more interaction with the platform, and this as well goes to the ads system.
On a personal level, when you go into Facebook and you look for something on Google at the same time, you will see ads for that product coming up on Facebook. This is the frightening thing for somebody who's a technological Luddite, that these people are aware of what I am searching on Google. You placed huge emphasis on the local, Victor, in your presentation, the importance of the local. I work in a station that has pioneered local news for the last 50 years. and understands the importance of it. And how do you think that fits in with this whole global thing of the social media? How do we get a local element which is important to people while there's this whole big thing going on around us?
Yes, such a great question, and it's a challenge because there really are so few economic incentives to ensure, first, that there is local news production to begin with, and second, that it's actually amplified through the social media that we've been talking about. And right now, the main business model, since it is being driven by advertising, is that they are trying, whether we're talking about Facebook or Fox News, they're trying to capture our attention and deliver it to advertisers. And as long as that is the basic business model, that's going to be the driving commercial logic that will determine what kind of news appears, manifests in our various outlets. So I think we do have to, as democratic societies, intervene and try to change those incentives into, whether it's through subsidies or other indirect measures, to make sure that we are getting that kind of coverage. Unfortunately, at least in the United States and in many other countries, for traditional reasons based on norms, sometimes laws, public broadcasting stations are often hesitant to focus on local news media production. It's more about delivering national affairs to local communities instead of actually creating original local reporting. And that also needs to change.
Of course, that takes time, money, and resources.
This is right. We keep coming back to that, but I think if we see that democracy is at stake, then we really should be making public investments as democratic societies to ensure that this news happens. We do that around public education. Most countries do that around healthcare, not the United States. But I think it's a political choice.
Yeah, political will as well. You know, like it is important.
And just to add to this, I think the conversation is changing rapidly at the moment. So we used to talk to ministers of media or culture, or no offense here, but academia, and suddenly it's about national security. We talk to ministers of defense or, you know, secret services, and of course that's a whole new ball game at the moment. So talking about political will, I think a lot is changing at the moment.
I found it interesting that you said that journalists now, when they go to cover protests or demonstrations in Germany, will bring a security detail with them. Yes. We think of Germany as one of the most civilized and kind of law-abiding and non-rule-breaking countries in the world. That's unbelievable, really.
Yes, I think the amount of violence on the fringes of these Querdenker and anti-vaxxer protests is just mind-boggling. Regular police officers are also not used to deal with this and don't know exactly which side they are on. Shall we protect the journalists or not? I think now they know. But this took a bit of time to adjust because, yeah, the phenomenon was just unheard of like a couple of years ago.
It's a scary prospect, it really is. Razan, if I could just to concentrate, I know there are some questions that Evelyn has on the Slido app, but I just want to focus on what's happening in Central Europe at the moment. You mentioned pro-Kremlin, pro-Russia propaganda. Watching the coverage, you have to say that there's propaganda coming from both sides. It's very hard to be clear what's actually happening and what it means for us long-term, particularly in Europe, as far as the balance of power globally is concerned.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the amount of misinformation was, it's on a scale I was mentioning that I haven't seen before. Like millions of videos across platforms, TikTok, Facebook, Twitter, and these videos are not related. They are from Syria, from China, from military exercises from 2015 or 2016. And actually, one of the videos that I worked on was from 2020. It was used by anti-vaccine movement as misinformation. It's completely misinformation. And we saw the same video being used to say that the war on Ukraine is a hoax. You know, it's exactly the same video being used different times by misinformation actors. So yeah, absolutely, it is coming from all sides. However, it is important to mention that sophisticated propaganda coming from the Russian side is something like beyond. And what they are doing, like the Russian media is not on the platforms anymore, but what they are doing right now, replacing the Russian media with embassies account, the account of the Russian embassies across the world, where they are amplifying the propaganda, spreading misinformation, justifying wars, and also a blatant misinformation, like videos completely fabricated and being used and posted by embassies accounts. Yeah, and just when we talk about two sides or misinformation coming from both sides, I don't think this is fair, because we have a country invading another democratic country. So they are not both sides, they are not equal. So that is also need to be mentioned, you know, like it is definitely, and it is getting more sophisticated as well. And as I mentioned as well, the Russian propaganda, one of their objectives is just to confuse the people looking at this information, just to say, oh my God, so what's the truth? So just even to manipulate public opinion.
The snow globe effect, to shake it all up.
Exactly.
Yeah, Evelyn, I think there are some questions that have come in on the
We do
app.
have some questions on Slido, but I think we'll go to the floor first. Would anyone like to ask Razan, Victor or Olaf a question? If so, we'll go as far as you first before we go to Slido. You can still ask your questions on Slido. It's the app. It's on the inside page of, just scan it on your booklet, or of course we have them around the room as well. So I don't know, are there any questions from the floor for our panelists? Joe Reddington.
No, you can hear me without the mic. Okay, very good. So I posted it on Slido as well, but I'm just very interested in for you, Victor, but anybody else can jump in. It's the question of the regulation of Facebook and Google and so on. That if you need to create in America or anywhere else a network of IMSs, so there's independent media centers, IMCs, and you need to regulate Facebook and other social media, what's the pathway to having that done, so that you can get the algorithms to suit the kind of trusted journalism that we're trying to create from these centres? Like, there's a big leap to get that done, and I'm asking that in the context of Ireland being the headquarters for Google and Facebook and Twitter and so on, and that we will have a role, for example, in that in Europe. But it seems like a very big leap from the internet jungle we have now to a regulated space, or a more regulated space, where that journalism could actually flourish.
Yes, thank you for that question. We're in the middle of heated debates right now in the States, precisely around this question of how do we regulate the platforms. And in my view, there's probably too much emphasis on trying to stop the bad stuff, which we do need to try to stop the bad stuff, but not enough emphasis on ensuring that there is reliable and diverse news and information being produced in the first place, and then making sure that people can access it through places like Google and Facebook. And there's real debate about what governments are allowed to do right now. I mean, Olaf mentioned earlier that there's been some positive developments at the state level, so state governments have been able to advance various initiatives. But when it comes to regulating the platforms, these are global problems. I think the DSA gives us some hope that there is a regulatory mechanism, but internationally we're going to have to it can't be one country at a time. We really need to harmonize our efforts around this. Unfortunately, right now it's mostly on the self-regulatory, just trying to blame and shame the platforms and try to get them. So right now they could say that, yes, they're able to do this algorithmically to privilege public media, for example, in their news feeds. So if we can try to really pressure them to do that, but ultimately I do think there's going to need to be some kind of regulation, a global regulation of some kind.
Olaf wants to come in on that
very
as well.
briefly, I mean, there is a little bit of a blueprint for this in the old analog days, where the scarcity was on the supply side, which led to must-carry rules, basically obliging cable operators, for example, to carry local news. Now the scarcity is on the demand side, like eyeballs. And this leads kind of to a logic of must-be-found regulation, or in legalese terms, it's called due prominence. And this is kind of already enshrined in the DSA and the Code of Practice on Disinformation, so obliging platforms, be it search, be it social media, but also advertising technology companies, to give a competitive advantage to trustworthy sources of information. And then the next question is, how do you define this? Right? And this is what I talked about earlier.
Okay, and on Slido, Zoran Medved from RTV Slovenia has a question for Victor. Do mainstream media see radicalized right-wing media, do mainstream media see the radicalized right-wing media ecosystem, and why do they not react on it with their own social and business models?
Excellent question. There is some progress on this front, I'm happy to say, where finally mainstream media are not constantly doing the both sidesism, false equivalence. You have people on the left saying this, people on the right saying this. They are now saying, especially around questions sometimes referred to as the big lie, that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. They've been very consistent to say that is simply false. And this has really placed a wedge between mainstream media and far-right media like Fox News, for example. And unfortunately, there's now a whole ecosystem to the right of Fox News. But as far as whether they have their own, I mean, they all have the same business model right now in our commercial media. I mean, it's all reliant on advertising, and in many cases, you know, MSNBC is supposedly our liberal alternative to Fox News, but they cover many issues in very similar ways. So I keep coming back to this idea that we need a public alternative that is not so reliant on these commercial values, these commercial incentives, and I don't see any way around that.
And Victor, the second question is for you as well, and it's also from Zoran. What are the most common conditions for media deserts in any country?
I think it's really a case of market failure. Again, where now we're also starting to do research on public media news deserts to show that despite their universal service mandate, there are many communities that actually don't have access to public media. But when it comes to commercial media, it's very clear that for-profit entities they're not incentivized to go into these news deserts and create the news that they won't be able to accrue profit on. They're not going to be able to pay for this. News is no longer profitable. At one point, advertising made it profitable enough, and that sort of obfuscated the public good nature of news and information. And now there's no market incentive. It's not rational for them to do this. So there really is no market solution. As much as I wish that weren't true, I think the evidence is very clear on this.
Thank you. Any other question from the
Does
floor
anyone
before we
else,
wrap up? Oh,
O'Cullen.
O'Cullen.
If plurality of sources is a concern of regulation and regulators, mustn't concentration of ownership be addressed as a matter of urgency? I refer to Elon Musk's bid to buy Twitter.
Who wants to take it first? You start, Olaf. I noticed you nodding there.
Yes, I think this is high up on the agenda of the European Commission, plurality not only of content but also of ownership, and I mean starting with transparency. However, interestingly, for example, if we take RSF's World Press Freedom Index, we have a number of countries which are very high up in terms of press freedom, like Sweden, for example, which is probably the most concentrated media markets in the world. Still very much pluralism there, not because of diversity of ownership, but because you have internal pluralism inside a media organization, which I think can also, particularly in smaller markets and really tiny markets even, be of help.
Razan, I wanted to ask you a final question, you and Victor, before we wrap up. You mentioned the value that authoritarian regimes place on being able to manipulate the media. Why don't democratic politicians see the value of public service media and how it can help them in running their democracies?
You mean from here, like from?
Why is there such a reluctance on the part of lots of politicians to enter the fray and to say we need a public service media because it will protect our democratic principles?
Because there's only one voice and there's only one ruler, one opinion. So actually this is a big threat to have different voices and to have like different opinions in public media. So it is the ultimate objective for this authoritarian government is to control everything, and including information, access to information. Any other voice is not allowed. So even politicians, local politicians, or other people in these countries trying to influence, trying to do, but still it is a threat for their lives. It could be, they could be arrested, disappear. So it is as well on personal safety, you know. So that's why, like the movement, that political change in this region or other authoritarian government is really slow and difficult. And that's where we need like different voices, actually a help, I'd say, as well from different countries to help people tell their stories, not only from inside specific country.
Hords, I think we have to leave it there. We're running out of time. Very interesting discussion, and I think I'd go on for another hour or two talking to you about all this, but we'll thank you for the moment. Olaf Steenfadt, Razan Ibraheem, and Victor Pickard, thank you very much for your very interesting contributions.
Go míle maith.